So hello, my name is Matthias Barksted. I'm an associate investigator at the COES and also professor of sociology at the Catholic University. So I had the pleasure to be here with Professor Leslie McCall. She is professor of sociology and political science of the Graduate Center at City University, New York, and associate director of the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality. And she's also one of our keynote speakers in the 10th conference of the COES taking place on November 2023. So since you are here, Leslie, we want to take advantage of your presence and ask you about your research, ask you about how you think things are going in this world, So to open up the dialogue, how about if you can tell us a little bit, in broad terms, about your proposal regarding how we should understand popular responses to economic inequality. From what I've read from your work and from what I saw today, perhaps you could also address why should we transit from a single dimensional to a multidimensional approximation?
Right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to this conference. It's very exciting that it's been 10 years already.
Yes, very fast.
And as I said earlier, I've learned a lot from learning about Chile. Has helped me to better understand the U.S. case. So not only learning about Chile, important in and of itself, but also has a lot of lessons, I think, for the U.S. So the multidimensionality part does have to do with how important, there are a couple different ways in which I use the multidimensionality, but it has to do with how important the market societies are and how strong the market is, how strong a role it plays in the United States as well as I think in Chile. And that's one aspect of it, so that we are trying to better understand how people think about the market itself rather than just assume that it is a free market and whatever happens in the free market is just given, and that the way we reduce inequality in the market is through government policies. So I see that as a multidimensional issue, like which dimensions, which spheres, the private sphere or the public sphere is responsible for reducing inequality. And most people only focus on the public sphere as being responsible for reducing, and then just leave the market to itself, right? And then we correct the market through public policies. So my work has tried to bring in the dimension of the market sphere and to try to ask, well, do people actually want greater intervention and greater justice in the economic sphere? So market justice or economic justice. And then the other dimensionality, and it turns out that matters. Adding that dimension makes a big difference in terms of understanding people's preferences for reducing inequality. And then the other aspect has to do with expanding it to dimensions outside of class, but to include gender and race. And these are very important for, COES has been very influential in talking not only about conflict that's brought about by inequality, but also potentially cohesion that can occur within societies across different axes of difference, race or gender. So we can't ignore those. We can't say, let's address class inequality without addressing these other dimensions of inequality. I think that creates conflict. If we focus on one dimension or another, then that potentially creates political conflict. Whereas I'm trying to look at economic inequality as something that is that affects class inequality, but also racial and gender inequality are also economic, right? It's not 100% economic, but those are dimensions of inequality that need to be addressed in the economic sphere as well.
Okay, thank you very much. So following up from your presentation today, regarding this, your approach to your multidimensional approach towards inequality and popular responses to inequality, you were mentioning that American exceptionalism perhaps is not that, or United States is not that exceptional as the literature many years has thought it is regarding popular beliefs about inequality. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. I didn't get a chance to say this. I probably should have said it more clearly, but It still is exceptional, just not exceptional in the way that that we normally think of it as, and also that bringing in these other dimensions helps us understand other countries besides the U.S. as well. So the two aspects of American exceptionalism that I wanted to emphasize and that I was analyzing today with the data that I presented today have to do with free market ideology. I think that's a really important part of it. And then also what I call a level playing field, which is very similar to American dream ideology, which is that everyone has an equal chance to get ahead. There are perceptions that everyone has an equal chance to get ahead, regardless of their class background, their race, or their gender. And that as a result, then economic inequality is fair. Outcomes in the market are fair. Those are the two ideas that I have been trying to address that are part of American exceptionalism. So these would be the ideas that people are against government intervention, and they're also pro-free market, opposed to the government, pro-free market, and also that they believe everyone has an equal chance at getting ahead regardless of their background. Those are the two parts of American exceptionalism that I have been trying to analyze with data, like pick apart these and say, okay, do Americans really believe in these? And the answer, I think, is no. I think the data suggests that people do perceive a hierarchy of advantage, that groups who are structurally advantaged by gender and by race and by class are perceived to have advantages in getting ahead economically. And those people who are disadvantaged structurally by race, gender, and class are actually perceived by the public to have fewer advantages in getting ahead. And these correlate very well, actually, with other questions that suggest a structural orientation. And also, as I presented, when you look at the US compared to other countries, there are actually more people who have believe these structural factors matter than in a typical rich, high-income country. So that's one aspect. And then the other aspect, and this is where really the American exceptionalism comes in, where there is American exceptionalism, it's just a little different than what people commonly think of it as. And that is a very high share of people who think that private companies or unions, but especially private companies or unions or high-income people are responsible for reducing inequality. So a low share of people say government is most important for reducing inequality, but the same share or higher share thinks that private companies are responsible. That's the biggest part, along with unions and with high-income people. That is very, very small share of people think that income inequality shouldn't be reduced, or that low-income people should be blamed themselves, that they're responsible for it. So that's exceptional because only a couple other countries are like that. Switzerland has a low level of response that says that government is most responsible, but a high level, like the US, that says that private companies and unions and high-income individuals are responsible. So that's exceptional, that's an exceptional aspect of it, but not in the way we normally think of it.
Okay. So actually, related to that, you were showing today in one of your last slides, these really linear, clear trends between like per capita income and percent of the population that favored egalitarian enhancing policies. For the state, there was a negative correlation. Mm-hmm. So the higher the income, average income, the lower support for government redistribution, and the higher the income, the higher the percent of people, population, supporting private actors, perhaps to give it some name, to private actors enhancing, in taking care, engaging in equality enhancing policies. That was really surprising because, when I think about high income countries, there's a lot of countries that come up, but one of them is, of course, like Nordic Europe, where you don't think that there's going to be low support for the state, non-intervention economy, state, post-tax, redistribution policies. So here's a double question. How do you explain that, or do you have an explanation, hypothetical, of why you have the negative and that positive trend? And that positive trend, doesn't it mean that capitalism becomes reflexive you know, that as income increases, I'm thinking a little bit like Englehart, post-materialism, as capitalism somehow it takes, as a system, you know, starts taking more responsibility for the externalities of the way of working. I don't know. Get where I'm trying to.
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely. We are just starting to understand this, and you've summarized it perfectly. So the part that's pretty well known is that as countries become richer, their support for government redistribution declines. That's a pretty well-known finding. That's that negative sloping line. And mainly, I think most people think that that's due to the fact that probably the post-materialism, like people are already taken care of economically, right? So they don't see, there already has been redistribution. So they do not necessarily see, from the government, they do not necessarily see that there needs to be more. Denmark is the classic case here. Denmark has pretty low support for government redistribution, but that's mainly because they've already have a lot of government redistribution.
It's like normalized.
Yeah, they're high income and they have a lot of redistribution, so they don't necessarily think that they need more redistribution. So that might be, Denmark is a little bit of an outlier, but that could be more generally the case, not at the same level, but for the Nordic countries. The part that we did not know about, really, and that became evident with this question, is that this increase in public support for the private actors to reduce inequality as the income of a country increases. So higher income countries are more likely to identify private actors as the most important in reducing inequality. That was a surprise. We had we had some indication that we would find this in the U.S. In the U.S. case, but that we have such a strong and significant association across our countries is pretty interesting. Whether or not that is because, I'm not sure it's corporations that become more reflexive. It may be that people in these countries, in higher income countries, see the power of capitalism and see the importance and the influence that it has in their societies, and want it to have less of the kind of influence that it has, less of the inequality creating influence that it has, and that they are powerful actors that should be held to account in these ways that people really desire. They really do desire less inequality, and they perceive CEOs, executives as making a lot of money, maybe a lot more money than they should be making. Definitely a lot more money than they should be making, according to a number of other surveys. So I think I can't answer whether the corporations themselves are becoming more reflexive because that's not our data. Our data is the public. And I think that what you see is that instead of people moving more towards a pro-free market stance, as in not supporting intervention in the market, that as societies become higher income and more free market oriented in their regulation policies, that the public becomes more interested in holding corporations accountable for inequality.
Exactly. So actually, just as a comment, so we were mentioning before during our the part after the comments after your presentation. So in one of your recent articles, you find that trust in the market is a very predictive variable of support for either, which is surprising, for either government redistribution policies or private actor redistribution, equality enhancing policies. So that remembered me like, so why would people trust in the market, or what would make people trust more or less in the market? And while thinking about that, I remember an article from Klaus Offen, this German sociologist, that's around like 2000. He has an article about political disaffection, like what people disaffect from politics. And he says in that article, he proposes that it's basically because people feel that political elites are very like opportunistic, opportunity driven. They just are not able to self-control or restrain. I was thinking about perhaps something like just about what you mentioned, but it could also be perhaps like in the behind trust in the market, it could be different levels of perception of how much like business elites and CEOs and so forth, are able to like restrain their like, their how much they're willing to restrain profit for like avoiding environmental degradation or having enhancing equality policies and so forth. It could be interesting because unintended ramification is that if all this works out to be as I'm describing it, if you have business elites self-restraining, building up a positive social reputation, you could actually be eroding public support for equality enhancing measures, and that's fear.
Right.
So.
Yes, these are all really important distinctions that need to be made. So on the one hand, I think that what's important to realize, and one reason why I didn't talk about this in the talk is because it takes a little bit more time to contextualize it, is that most Americans do not trust the market, do not trust market organizations. So overall, they don't support market interventions or private actors, and the importance of private actors in reducing inequality. They don't do that as a result of their having trust in those organizations. They actually support that as a result of having distrust in those organizations. So in other words, people who have high levels of distrust in corporations also have high levels of support for corporations to reduce inequality. Okay? And that's the majority of people. The majority of people are in that category. A minority of people, I mentioned this at the talk this morning, a minority of people are high income and a right-leaning partisanship. They are trusting of corporations, and they also do not support either government or private actors in reducing inequality.
Okay.
So we really have to focus on that group of people which has not generally been acknowledged. The majority, a large majority, not a simple majority of people who distrust corporations, but yet want to see them held accountable, as I said earlier. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so I know you're more of a, I don't know if this is unfair to call you more of a public opinion specialist than a certification specialist, though you are study issues about certification. But in your opinion, the American dream ideology, which is very, based on what you were saying before, it's perhaps not that exceptional in the US as we normally think about it, but still this, popular stereotypes about it, the land of the free, not the land of free, land of opportunity, and some person from the other part of the world can get there and through effort and work can actually get ahead. So, but based on your knowledge and research, is there, how can I call it? Is there like an objective background that justifies or gives some credibility to the American dream ideology? Like, for example, are in the US social mobility rates different from other comparable post-industrial, advanced, democratic, rich countries?
No.
Okay. Which makes it even more interesting,
Yeah. So I mean,
okay.
So the U.S. has lower social mobility than other countries, and so what is, I think, different than what we knew before, based on the research that I presented today, is that Americans also are more critical, right, of the lack of social mobility. Right, they see that there are particular factors that are structural in nature and not individualistic in nature, that do reduce social mobility and upward mobility. So your class background, coming from a wealthy family, having educated parents, your racial or gender background, knowing the right people, the kinds of connections that you have. And I think it's important not to overplay this, because in all countries, mostly all the countries that we have in this data set, there are 30 countries in the data set. In most countries, there are more people who say that hard work is important in getting ahead than there are people who say that these structural factors are important in getting ahead. Okay, so my conclusion from that is that everyone thinks hard work is important in getting ahead, right? It just is, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's true for all groups that hard work is important. It's essential. It's part of what we think of, I think, in most places as important for our individual and collective success. That doesn't mean that necessarily people embrace individualism. It's more about acknowledgement of the reality. So we're not saying hard work is, really important to people. It's more that there's an acknowledgement that it's necessary. But that's not the whole story. But that's usually where the story ends. People do have these more structural orientations, not in the same degree, but you could see that Americans, like people in other countries, feel that these other structural factors are important. And in fact, they're more likely than people in other countries to perceive that these structural factors are important. So in other words, Americans are recognizing these structural barriers, and they're recognizing them more than people in other countries. Now, is that because people in other countries have social mobility, and in the US there isn't that social mobility? I can't tell whether that's the case or not. But certainly the American dream would suggest that people don't think there are any barriers to getting ahead. And so just the fact that you see higher numbers of people in the US recognizing these barriers, I think, is important. Contrast to that common view.
Okay. So related to that again, so in your research, you field surveys in which people receive treatments in which you can please correct me later, because I'm gonna frame it as informational treatment effects.
Yes.
Where you show them objective, nonpartisan, trends in inequality and growing inequality, and then you ask them to rank or to rate the importance of different elements, to get ahead in life. And then you separate like the structural that I was talking about just before, like the structural factors like coming from a wealthy family, having educated parents, and versus individualistic factors like hard work and ambition. Okay.
Yes.
And
personal ambition. Yeah.
And the treatment effects show that more or less the importance relative to a control group, the importance people rate, the structural factor grows and the individualistic factor decreases. So is there an implicit zero-sum game between these two core elements, or could they vary separately, or so forth?
Yes. So this is by the way, you again characterized it perfectly.
Thank you.
This is an interesting question that we've only done a little bit of exploratory analysis on, but we don't fundamentally think of these as zero-sum. We thought of them as multidimensional.
Okay.
That people can believe in hard work at the same time that they also perceive these structural factors. And we think the hard work part is just being realistic, as I mentioned earlier. People recognize that it's just in the world in which we live, it is important to work hard, but it's not the whole story. And so therefore, they also have these structural views. So that was the way we originally kind of conceptualized it. But in looking, and we did predict that people would decrease. So they already have high levels of belief that hard work is important, but we thought they would decrease those. So we did have a zero-sum, I think, expectation regarding the experimental situation.
Okay.
Where people would, even though they have a high level of believing that hard work is important, they decrease the importance of hard work. And then they would increase in the treatment, they would increase their perceptions of structural factors. So in that sense, it does seem like a zero sum. And we have looked at the data not in our survey experiments, although I've looked at it in the survey experiments too, but also in the national level data and the International Social Survey Program. I've looked at it at each country, and the correlation between the beliefs about how important hard work is and how important these structural factors are. That correlation should be negative if it's a zero sum.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so the people who believe hard work is really important should believe that these structural factors are not important. So that would be the zero sum and negative correlation. And we do find that for the US, but it's a small correlation. It's around the order of 0.10. And out of the 29 countries, only a handful had negative correlations.
Okay.
But they're all low. They're statistically significant because it's a high N, but the substantive size of the correlation is pretty small. But there are a lot of countries that have positive effects. So Chile is actually one of them, where the people who rate hard work as important are also the people who rate these structural factors as important. But again, the correlation is small. So I like to think of it as two dimensions, that people are thinking not only that hard work is important, which I think is a realistic reaction to the state of the economy and the world, but also that these structural factors are important as well.
Would a positive correlation between the individualistic and structural factors signal that it's like for people it's very hard to get away in terms of perception?
I think that, yes, I think that, exactly. I think that's one way of thinking about it. We haven't really done a lot of work, and I haven't seen anyone else do work in this area. Professor Castillo and I are going to be talking about exactly this because he is doing some work on this topic about the moving from a single dimension, either you're individualistic or you're structuralist, to a two-dimensional space. But that's the way I interpret it, I think. People are just saying, like, it all matters because it's all challenge, right? It's challenging to get ahead, period. So we need everything, Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So in order to wrap up, could you tell us about what's your future research agenda about? What are the future topics that you're interested in? And in your talk, you were telling about pulling politics in.
Yes. So we tend to look at the results that we have and say that instead of blaming people, the public, in the US specifically, for high levels of inequality, because that's often what American exceptionalism, right? Americans like inequality. They can get ahead. It motivates them to get ahead and reap the rewards of a high inequality society. But we find that people don't have high tolerance for inequality, that they expect a lot less inequality than they think exists, and they support policies in the market and in the government to reduce those policies, so to reduce that inequality. So our conclusion is then that the problem is one of political representation. So it's not a question that the government is just implementing the policies that the people want, that is high levels of inequality and low levels of government support or low levels of interventions in the market, but rather that the government is not representing what appear to be people's desires for a lot less inequality, both overall as a result of government policy, but also specifically inequality in pay in the marketplace. So we are in the field right now trying to ask more questions about policy preferences and also about people's desires to work across what are seen as social divisions of race and gender, and whether or not that ability to perceive that people from a number of different social groups are on the losing end of inequality. So therefore could work together to create a more equal market, a labor market to the extent possible through things like unionization, through better representation of workers on corporate boards, through more state regulation of executive pay and minimum wages, things like that, that could be used to create greater equality of pay, and in addition to some of the government policies that would reduce inequality. So we're looking into those kinds of perceptions along the lines of what COES is doing on cohesion. To what extent do people feel that they're in a similar economic situation, even though they might have different class backgrounds I'm talking about middle class and lower class and poor people. Even though they might have different class backgrounds, they might have different racial backgrounds, they might be of different genders.
You tell me if I'm right or wrong. So in political science, you see normally that when people try to model electoral preferences, they think like in terms of dimensionality. So there's like, and this is very common in Europe, like you have one dimension that's like the socioeconomic difference between left and right. And you also have some latent, more sociocultural kind of dimension, which organizes people along more conservative values and more progressive values. And in Europe, as far as I've seen, like these two things, you know, it's not like the one's a part of the other, but they kind of work a little bit. They work differently, you know. So, would you agree that what you're saying is that we got to pull these two dimensions back together? Basically, is that it's not that one, you know, issues about gender equality are sociocultural in terms of cultural norms that are behind them or underlying them, but there's also like material, economic issues related to them, you know, as the other dimensions you were mentioning as well. Would you agree with that?
Yes. I mean, too often we think of these as at cross purposes. The people who require or who desire greater social equality for groups of different social statuses based on race and gender, sexuality and other statuses, that is somehow not related to their concerns for greater economic equality. So we have to think of them as both, and that I'm trying to look at the economic part of that. You know, so people who are trying to create greater inclusion in the economic sphere and economic space and the workplace that we normally associate with greater integration within jobs, greater power really within the economy, greater economic power. But I think a lot of it has to do with just in the world in which we have such high levels of economic inequality, that people just needing greater material security through higher wages, through greater benefits, health care, pensions,
Social Security,
Social Security, greater access to high levels of education. That these are the things that are sort of driving people who are concerned about racial justice and gender justice, as well as economic and class justice, at least within that economic sphere.
Professor McCall, thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you very much.